Well, I have a sort of suggestion that before we decide either to save the planet or to destroy it, we pause for a moment of silence. I don't mean that kind of grim silence which one observes when somebody says such and such a famous person has just died, and we'll observe a moment of silence in his honor, and everybody frowns and thinks very serious thoughts. That's not silence at all. I mean real silence, in which we stop thinking and experience reality as reality is. Because after all, if I talk all the time, I can't hear what anyone else has to say. And if I think all the time, and by that I mean specifically talking to yourself subvocally inside your skull, if I think all the time, I have nothing to think about except thoughts. And so I'm never in touch with the real world. Now, what is the real world? Some people have the theory that the real world is material or physical. They say it's made of kind of a stuff. Other people have the theory that the real world is spiritual or mental. But I want you to point out that both those theories of the world are concepts. And the real world is not an idea. It is not words. Reality is. Find, therefore, that if you get with reality, all sorts of illusions disappear. And I will mention several illusions. Let's begin with some very down-to-earth ones, like money. Money is a very useful method of accounting. It is a measure of wealth, in the same way as inches are measures of length and grams measures of weight. Money simply represents wealth in rather the same way that the menu represents the dinner. Only we are psychologically perverted in such a way that some of us would rather have money than real wealth. But you know, there is a limit to what one can consume. So that's one of the sort of confusions I'm talking about. We confuse ourselves as living organisms with our idea of ourselves. That is to say, with the conception of myself, which is called the personality or ego. And it's an extremely crude and limited conception of oneself, of the actual, unique living organism. But most people nowadays say, I have no time. Of course you don't, because you are not aware of the present. You know, the present is represented on your watch by a hairline that is as thin as possible, as is consistent with visibility. We think ordinarily of the present as an infinitesimal point at which the future changes into the past. And we also do a terrible thing. We imagine ourselves to be results of the past. You see, we're always passing the buck, and don't realize that the past is caused by the present, as the wake of a ship flows back from the prow. Now, the wake doesn't drive the ship any more than the tail wags the dog. The truth of the matter is, it all begins here. This is where the creation begins. And you're doing it and won't admit it, because, of course, you're all God in disguise. Jesus found that out, and they crucified him for saying so. When modern Protestant theologians of the sort of liberal type are saying God is dead, they mean not that literally. They mean a certain image of God is dead. Because it was, after all, an idol. And when it says, thou shalt not make to thyself any graven image, it doesn't mean merely images of wood and stone, which nobody took seriously anyway. It means, above all, images made of imagination, images made of concepts. But it doesn't mean that God is dead, that life is nothing more than a trip from the maternity ward to the crematorium. It's much more spooky than that. because you can't think of the meaning of God. What does God mean? What is God useful for? And so in the same way you can ask, what does a tree mean? What does a cloud mean? What does a fern mean? What's it all about? Well, we've got on all kinds of weird theories that ferns exist in a certain way in order to propagate themselves. Like birds do all this thing in order to lay eggs so more birds come out. And the whole point of that is that there shall be more birds still. It is a purely engineering approach to life, which is completely senseless. Things don't mean anything. Birds don't mean anything. Trees don't mean anything. Words mean something, yes, because they point to something beyond themselves. They're signs. But if you take words too seriously, you're like a person who climbs a signpost instead of going where it points. And so if you suddenly say, but my life has no meaning, you're identifying yourself with a word. That's what we do. If I would identify myself with Alan Watts, that would be identifying myself with a concept, with words. A rather complicated mess of words, to be sure. But still, I would have made that mistake. It has to be understood about meditation that it's not an exercise, it's not a gymnastic, it's not the ordinary sort of self-improvement procedure. And one does it not to be good for you, but just because you dig it. Because at last you find yourself in the center, the eternal now, in which past and future drop away, in which divisions created by words drop away. Can you point to the division between my 5 fingers? Can you, in other words, touch the difference between them? Can't be done. Because the difference is conceptual. True, they can all move independently, but only because they're one with the body, and the body is one with its environment. You cannot separate those. It's like bees and flowers. Where there are no flowers, there are no bees. Where there are no bees, there are no flowers. They look very different, but they are essentially one organism. The head and the feet look very different, but they are parts of one organism. Not really parts. Parts is a mechanical word. Like got any spare parts. The organism doesn't have parts, it has features. Now, there's not very much point in merely talking about this. You can understand it only by doing it. Only by doing it. You can understand it only by doing it.